Canada is going through the worst epidemic of deaths from illegal drug overdoses in its history. Nearly 25,000 people have died between 2016 and 2021, deaths that were entirely preventable, according to the author of a new book. In fact, scholar, activist, and author Susan Boyd argues the crisis is the end result of 2 centuries of failed government policy. And she's here now to talk about heroin and illustrated history. Welcome, Susan.
Welcome. Thank you for having me on the show.
So you've been researching and writing about heroin since at least 2011. What made you come out with the book now?
Yeah, I started the book initially because I was working with a group in the downtown east side of Vancouver. It was called SNAP, the Salome Naomi Association of Patients. And they were the first people in Canada to receive heroin-assisted treatment through 2 clinical trials that ran out of Vancouver. And at the same time, as you mentioned, the illegal drug overdose crisis was emerging. And I couldn't understand when the crisis emerged that we didn't immediately set up heroin-assisted treatment programs throughout Canada to try to save lives. So I started to look more closely at heroin and the history of heroin. And I was also collaborating with this group, SNAP, and wanted to better understand the drug and its history for them as well. And I was very curious about the history of heroin because it's used legally for therapeutic use in other Western nations. But in Canada, it's basically had been banned since the mid-50s, but it had been never used until recently for a substitution drug for people who might be dependent on opioids. So that's why I started to look at the past so I could understand better our present day and our failure to respond to these preventable deaths. And I think it was fruitful in the sense that it gave me some idea of why our ideas about the drug heroin and why we fail to respond to the poison drug supply immediately in a way that would be forceful and prevent these deaths.
Now, you point out that while you were writing the book in early 2020, governments, great and small, were taking actual concrete steps against COVID-19 compared to the few or no steps taken against illegal overdose deaths, drug toxicity. Were you struck by this contrast?
Completely struck by it. I have to say that BC did the best job across the nation and even declared a public health emergency in relation to the overdose crisis in 2016. But even with that, it was nothing in comparison to what rolled out once COVID hit this, our nation. And you had to wonder, why were the overdose deaths seen as less valuable, or those people seen as less valuable than people who were dying or were ill of COVID? And it was such a contrast, the amount of money and resources that were put in place due to COVID. And I have no problem with that. I just wanted to see it matched in relation to the illegal drug overdose crisis.
Well, it took like a week, perhaps, if that, for BC to declare COVID a public health emergency, while
That's right.
The province, as you point out, 6 years to declare the toxic drug crisis one. So there's clearly a disparity there.
A huge disparity. And also the Yukon is the only other region that is called a public health crisis in relation to the overdose death in Canada. And so I find that just, you have to ask yourself, why? How could this be? Why are people who use narcotics or other criminalized drugs discriminated against in this way? Like, what if we learned about this drug and the people who use it that makes us see them as not worthy of having services and provisions that would keep them safe?
Well, heroin, as you point out, was first marketed in 1898 as a pain reliever, a cough suppressant, and it went from being used by law-abiding citizens to terms like dope fiends, junkies, criminal addicts, and you make the very good point, drug use seen as a moral failing or a weakness as opposed to a disease.
That's right. That's right. We saw this shift that went on in relation to drug use seen as a moral failing if somebody was using it continuously and somehow it was affecting their behavior. But most often, there was no category of medical or non-medical use, and people weren't demonized for using the drug. But we did start to have social and political changes where we started to frame drug use as not just a moral failing, but as a disease of the body, a disease of the brain, and now a pathology as well. But the most difficult issue is that we criminalized non-medical use of narcotics, including heroin. And so this idea of using punishment and the law to stop people from using a substance has really been a failed policy for over a century. But we seem to not learn from that. We have plenty of evidence of how it's failed right into the present. And there's a contradiction there as well. Like, if someone is seen to be having a disease, how can we criminalize their use? But we do, and there's many contradictions in Canadian policy. And harm reduction services that emerged in the 1990s, and again, now with our recent epidemic, counter some of the harms of drug prohibition and the criminalization of heroin and other narcotics and drugs, but they can't fully do that. I mean, they're just services. Really, there needs to be a larger change, change in the law, change in the way that we perceive drug use in itself.
Because you point out that the harms and benefits of drug use can be compounded and in some cases wholly created by drug policy, and which is what got us here in the first place. This idea that failed drug policy has created these crises that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, I try to highlight in the book that the consequences of drug use is completely linked to our social status. And so if you're poor and you're using illegal drug, you have to buy smaller amounts, usually very visibly on the street. There's you find discrimination in relation to health services, and for Indigenous and Black people, that's even more so. You have more encounters with criminal justice, law enforcement, if you're buying on the street instead of like going to a house or having someone deliver it to your nice house in a middle-class neighborhood. And also access to treatment or, healthcare is quite different. For a wealthy person, they can even go to a private treatment center or, detox. But for everybody else, they have long waiting lists to be able to access these services. And so often what we're seeing is not even the effect of the drug. We might be seeing years of discrimination and poverty and racial injustice. And it's hard to unpack that, but our drug policy definitely is discriminatory in relation to our social status.
I think you put it really well in the book when you say heroin, the drug, is neither good nor bad. The pharmacology of any drug, including heroin, is really only a small part of its story. It's perception in society, I guess you're saying.
Yes. Yeah, and our expectation of that drug, what we know about that drug, the setting that we do the drug in, all of these shape our drug use as well. I was looking at the DSM and their criteria for opiate use disorder, and some of the criteria could be related to the social setting. They're saying using drugs in dangerous places. And when you think about a person who might be poor buying heroin on the street and wanting to use it right away because, if they walk 2 blocks down the road, they might encounter a police officer who would arrest them, for possession. So in the book, I'm trying to challenge these ideas about what we think we know about addiction or drug use or dependency, what we know about the drug heroin and the outcome of using that drug. Because interestingly enough, we had and continue to have such harsh drug policy, like 7 years imprisonment for possession of heroin, life imprisonment for selling or dealing or trafficking heroin. And not that everybody would get that harsher sentence and be sent to prison, but just to say that our drug policy and our drug law is very harsh. In the 1950s and early 60s, about 90 Canadians went to the UK because they had heard that they could receive heroin through legal prescribing through a physician. And those 90 people were interviewed, and what they expressed most often was that in the UK, they could lead what they called a normal life, a life where they weren't criminalized. But in Canada, what they faced was prison and discrimination and harassment by law enforcement. And I thought that was so interesting, the contrast. Like, we've known this for a long time, that if we provide heroin-assisted treatment or a prescription of a narcotic to an individual, that they don't have to be involved then in any type of criminal activity, even if that's just buying it on the illegal market. And we know, as you mentioned, the illegal market now is very much a poison drug supply that is, leading to all of these preventable deaths. And so I wanted to communicate that to readers, that possibly all of these myths and demonization that we've heard for a century has been in many ways informing us about heroin use. But in fact, they are myths and tropes, and they're very misplaced and not accurate. And that if we could just change our ideas in some way, change our policies right away, we could prevent further deaths. And, to think about it in terms of, why would we ever think that punishment in any form could stop people from using a substance? It doesn't work. We have plenty of evidence to demonstrate that it doesn't work. And to think about someone who is using a narcotic, whether illegal or not illegal, as our children, as our loved ones, as a wife or a husband, someone that's beloved to us, and we want to keep them safe. The alternative, what we've been doing for a century, certainly isn't keeping people safe or allowing them to participate, in Canadian society in the way that they would want to.
As you put it, we need to know the history of heroin and drug prohibition in order to understand its present and its future. So, having said that, what is the future? Is it decriminalization? Is it safe supply? Is it a combination of these things?
Yeah, I would like to see us legally regulate all currently criminalized drugs, and that would be different for each drug. Just as we legalize cannabis, it would be quite different than legalizing a drug like heroin. But in the meantime, what I think we can do right away is like full decriminalization of all drug possession, and also of selling or sharing drugs for your own habit, your own drug use. That we could do that immediately, but also to create better safe supply across the nation, especially in rural areas where we haven't, had access to safe supply in the same way that you might in a city. I think we should redistribute our funds as well, less to policing people who use criminalized drugs, to, health services, harm reduction services, housing, all of the types of supports that everybody needs, not just people who use criminalized drugs. And there's a great policy platform that just got released before the new year, Decriminalization Done Right, a rights-based path for drug policy. And I think it spells it out quite well, how we could move forward to prevent these deaths and this immense harm that's happening daily. And certainly Caput, Vendu, other drug user groups, DOLF, have put forward similar proposals to move forward. So we're not lacking in the path forward. What we're lacking is political will, really, to change our policy.
Well, that was coming to my next question. Where do you think the resistance is coming from, and why is it still there?
I think we have we really cling to ideas about abstinence. I think it's related to our sort of colonial white supremacy, temperance ideas about the Canadian citizen as a white, sober citizen who embodies self-control. It's definitely mind-boggling to think that we would adopt this without even realizing that it continues to our presence. This idea that the sober citizen, and especially the white citizen, is the ideal and everybody else is the other. And that we would adopt this idea of punishment. But retribution is very much part of Christian theology. But in relation to this issue, I think we have to really scrutinize that framework and move forward to create a more just society for people.
And ultimately, Susan, what do you hope people get out of this book then?
I'm hoping that people will read this narrative and also hear about the resistance to our policy, drug user groups, individuals right from the 1940s to the present, asking for change, commissions saying we should create narcotic clinics, we should decriminalize drugs. I hope the images also tell an alternative story to the stories that we see sort of in popular culture about the deranged heroin user. I'm hoping that once we hear the story that the light bulb will go on and we'll say, oh, okay, we could have an alternative policy, a policy that would be more just, that would save lives, that would recognize that heroin shouldn't be romanticized or demonized, nor other narcotics, that we're a drug using nation. We have over 7,000 prescription drugs available to Canadians today. In the 1960s, we had 300 prescription drugs available. So we've seen this, massive change in relation to pharmaceutical drugs, but we have to find a relationship with them that's more positive and more life-sustaining, I think. So I'm hoping if people read the book, that they'll too come to the conclusion that we need to make this major change, and we need to make that change now and not later.
The name of the book is Heroin, an Illustrated History. It's available from Fernwood Publishing. My thanks to author Susan Boyd.
Thank you.